as the laptop went through the security, I went, bomb! There's a bomb in that bag! There's a bomb! And everything went crazy. I remember there were cameras, people were taking pictures of me on the social media, you know, people that obviously thought I was bonkers and thought it was funny, like making videos of me.
Why were you not arrested? Like, no offence, I would have arrested you. You can't go through an airport screaming bomb.
Well, because they could obviously see, they'd been tracking me for several hours in the airport, watching me and making a plan about how to handle me. So they obviously knew I was unwell and probably not a threat. That was obviously the decision and the conclusion they'd come to. But I remember actually after I shouted bomb, there were all these armed guards at Singapore, you know, surrounding me. There was like this one woman who was obviously kind of the boss and these other armed guards here. And it was terrifying. I really thought, like, this is it. They're gonna kill me. They told me that they needed to give me an injection to sedate me, to calm me down. And I absolutely believed with every fibre of my being it was a lethal injection and I was going to die.
Life today is chaotic, unpredictable, and constantly shifting. But within the chaos lies opportunity, and we're here to seize it. This is Generation Uncharted. Nichi Hodgson, back again. How are you doing?
For my sins, twice in quick succession. I'm good. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Very excited today to talk about your article that you've just had come out. So this is an article that you've written about your experience with psychosis. So tell us the story.
Oh my goodness. Well, about 10 years ago, lots of difficult things happened at the same time in the space of a few months. I was living between London and LA and I was constantly jet lagged. I was dating a really bad man in LA. I mean, he's just terrible, really, really bad idea. And I was spending all my money flying back and forth, and it was all, you know, it was one of those situationships that I thought was a relationship and he just didn't think anything about. And then very sadly, my dad died and he had a heart attack. He was only 67. He just died at home one day in Yorkshire and he lived by himself. I didn't find out for a few days. I was told on the phone by a police officer. It was pretty harrowing. And my family, my mum and my brother and his family, they all live in Australia. So when my dad died, I had no next of kin in the UK anymore. And it was quite a shocking thing to kind of face. And yeah, it was traumatizing. I was exhausted. I didn't have anything better to go to. So I went back to LA to date the stupid man. And slowly, my mental health started to really unravel in a way that it had never done before.
And you had mental health issues before this. So what was different this time that you hadn't dealt with before? Yeah,
well, obviously, if you are an avid fan of the podcast, you'll remember me talking to you about having been anorexic as a teenager and an early 20-something. So I'd had that, but I hadn't had anything after that. I'd been really well after I'd recovered. And psychosis, just to clarify, it's not a condition like bipolar or schizophrenia or something, but it's a symptom of a condition. So it can be part of one of those illnesses. It can be postpartum psychosis, which we talk about quite a lot. You know, mums going mad when they've had a baby, thinking that the baby isn't theirs and all this kind of cracker stuff. Very common because it's such a strain on the body having a baby, combined with the sleepless nights. And then obviously you will probably have heard of like drug and alcohol-induced psychosis, which again is very common. People take a substance and it makes them bonkers. But they tend to recover very quickly from those episodes. You know, it's kind of something that happens at a weekend and then by the Monday morning they start to come down again. But what happened with me is that I had what they call trauma-induced psychosis, which was caused by my dad dying so suddenly and so shockingly. But then because I wasn't sleeping, because I was travelling all the time and basically messing up my circadian rhythms, and also because I was sometimes taking the ADHD drug Adderall occasionally, which is basically methamphetamine and it's banned in this country for good reason. Because I was taking that occasionally to stay awake, I was just putting even more strain on my brain and my body. And then eventually...
Where were you getting this drug from if it's banned in the UK?
In America, because I was flying out there and everybody took it in LA. It's also a kind of diet drug, isn't it? It suppresses your appetite and keeps you awake for ages. So it's like the perfect workaholics. The perfect workaholics drug, and lots of people take it. I mean, I wasn't doing it regularly. And when I told the doctors, many months later when I was eventually helped, the doctors didn't think it triggered it. So that's why they don't call it drug-induced. I think it's important to talk about it, but it's important to clarify that they saw it as trauma-induced psychosis, which we don't talk about very much.
So tell me, how did you know that you had this, or did you know that you had this?
Well, that's exactly it. That's the catch. I didn't know I had it. So psychosis is really interesting in that it comes on very slowly and it starts by you having slightly odd thoughts. So maybe you'll notice somebody on the street and think they look suspicious, and you're not normally paranoid. You're not normally that kind of person. Your anxiety will go up. You might start to mistrust certain people that you've always trusted, close friends, family. You might have some kind of odd theories about why somebody has decided to cancel a dinner with you or something, something that you would never have thought in the past. And then before you know it, other things start to happen. So it changes your kind of perception of sounds, taste, touch. And, so for example, you'll think that there's like a pneumatic drill on the street, doing some excavation work. And maybe you're in an Uber and it sounds like the drill is inside the Uber. It's like it starts to kind of like bend and distort your understanding of like, your sensory perception of the world. And then you're having these odd thoughts on top of it. But because it creeps in so slowly, you don't notice that it's weird. And also, if you've never ever had any problems with your thinking before, why would you know that you were? And what I mean by that is we all actually trust our minds a hell of a lot day to day. Like you trust your mind to be able to tell you when to cross the road and not get run over by a car. Or you trust your mind to correctly interpret a friend's texts when they sound a bit sad or off, But with psychosis, the judgments that you're making are incorrect. But you don't know that because it just feels like your brain thinking. So it's very, very difficult, yeah.
This is giving me chills, and
yeah.
I know people make fun of me for this, but I'm just going to say it. One of my greatest fears in life is being crazy, but I don't know that I'm crazy and everyone else does. So it's almost like I have this fear sometimes, like people are talking to me like, oh, here he is, like we all know he's like not right, but like we don't say anything, and I'm like, I just think I'm normal, and I don't know why. That's always just been like a fear I've had, that I'm crazy, but like no one tells me that I'm crazy.
It's so interesting because basically psychosis is that. I mean, the other thing is that when it first starts, it's difficult for people to necessarily tell, unless they know really well that your thinking is odd. The other thing is that because it comes on so slowly, depending on how you relate the stories about what's happening, people do believe you. And in my particular case, because I was a journalist, living this quite out there life, I was working in LA, writing for Men's Health. I had a sex column. I was writing about the porn industry. When I said to people, oh, I think I've met the mafia, at a porn conference, well, it wasn't impossible. It wasn't totally implausible. It sounded logical. And also, if you've been a journalist on the record, renowned for your reporting and your truth-telling, why would you be lying? So it's like crazy things do happen sometimes. In my particular case, too many people believed my madcap theories and paranoia thoughts and delusions, including people that worked for the NHS, including the GP, including a doctor at a mental health clinic where I took myself one day, and loads of friends thought it was absolutely happening. So I was so poorly for so long because actually people drank my Kool-Aid, which sounds absolutely bonkers, doesn't it?
Yeah, no, that's worrying. And also worrying, as you say, that it creeps in, because I read something the other day that like the majority of our thoughts are negative, and that's just primal programming. It's like, don't worry about how sweet that cake tastes, worry about if there's poison in it, or worry if you might be in danger. So actually our brains are programmed to be quite negative and to see danger. So it's not wild that you might think, is that on, what was that sound? Is it inside the house? Is it outside the house?
Absolutely. It's about survival. It's kind of like I think what happened, the way I perceive psychosis now is it is a kind of protective mechanism. So when something terrible happens in your life that you cannot get your head round, you have a break from reality in order to protect you from the truth. And so in my case, the reality was that my beloved dad, who I was really close to, was gone, and that was it. And I couldn't handle it. The reality was the guy that I thought I was in love with and that I thought loved me he didn't care about me. The reality was I was struggling to get paid to work, Those things were the realities. And instead, I decided that I was being pursued by the mafia, that the guy that I'd been seeing was somehow involved in selling me into a sex trafficking ring, that I was going to get impregnated for the ring, for them to abuse this baby. Now, it will sound really far-fetched, but the other thing that's really, really curious about psychosis is that everybody that enters it has similar delusions. So most people think at some point they're being tracked or hunted down. Most people think they're being surveyed, like their devices are being watched, they're being watched. It's so common. Most people think that someone's trying to take their life, and many people take their own lives to save themselves in their kind of view. So this is all standard stuff. And if you're a mental health practitioner or doctor, you will recognise what I'm saying is the kinds of things that people come in with all the time when they are suffering from psychosis. But actually, ordinary people don't know anything about it. And we don't talk about it because it's so taboo. Because if you start telling your friends about that time you absolutely lost the plot, what are they going to think of you? If you say to your boss, it's like, are you trustworthy to work in a business? There are all these problems with admitting it. So that's why we don't know enough about it.
So having negative thoughts and being a little bit paranoid, I mean, we all sort of deal with that slightly on different levels day to day. At what point do these thoughts become a problem? And what were some of the extreme situations? I mean, you're talking there about the mafia and they're trying to get me pregnant, but were there any extreme situations that came about because of this that maybe became dangerous?
Yes. Gosh, where do I start? I mean, the main thing is, if your perception of reality is completely divorced from reality, you're going to start doing some pretty mad stuff. So, for example, I took myself to a solicitor to write my will, explained to the solicitor that I was being hunted and was likely going to be murdered. So I needed to write this will so that my brother and my mum, were protected, could inherit whatever I had left. Now, if somebody comes into a solicitor's office and says that to you, point blank, no intro, no evidence either, remember, it's just their word, then you should know that they're not okay. And eventually, when I started trotting out more stories about the sex trafficking ring and the ex being involved and then this other person, and then, oh, look, have you seen all these people on Facebook? They're definitely running some kind of trafficking ring. There wasn't any evidence to support what I was saying. It was just my story. So if you were smart, past a point, you realised that it couldn't be happening. And therefore, I was actually really unwell. And I mean, the kind of craziest thing that happened is that my ex-girlfriend, actually, I was in contact with, and she'd been a bodyguard, and I kind of got back in touch with her because I presumed she could, keep me safe. And she persuaded me to get a flight to Australia to go see with my family, go be with my family. Now, looking back, I don't think she understood how unwell I was, because you wouldn't actually put somebody who was completely psychotic on an aeroplane for 26 hours if you did know. And what happened is she took me to the airport and I got on the plane, and then I proceeded to tell the air crew that there was a bomb in my suitcase. We were en route to Brisbane via Singapore, and when we landed at Singapore, they designated me a sort of nurse to look after me, as they could obviously see that I was unwell. They didn't think I had a bomb in my suitcase.
Well, so what was the reaction? You lean over to the flight attendant and say, "There's a bomb in my."
Well, I
bag.
remember
What
really.
did they do?
I remember it really distinctly, because the other thing about psychosis is you're awake, you remember everything, you believe it's happening. It's not like some kind of mad dream. It's like you remember all the details. I remember I got out of my seat and I went to the back of the aeroplane, and there was this particular steward there that for whatever reason I'd taken a shine to. That happens a lot with psychosis. You get this feeling, this deep feeling that you can trust this one person and you're going to tell them everything and they're going to help you. And so I started to tell him my story, and I started to bow to him, which was really weird. I don't know why I started to do that. And he was like, "Are you okay?" And I was like, "Look, you really need to understand, I've got a bomb in my suitcase and it's been put there by the people that are trying to sex traffic me in." I remember just his face being like sheer panic. But then, within a few minutes, he was obviously talking to his colleagues, and he's just like, "There's no way this girl's got a bomb in her suitcase," And I learned later that that's because I'd been behaving really oddly since I'd got on the flight. This was kind of like 18 hours in, so they'd already clocked me as being unwell. But by the time we landed in Singapore, I was really crazy, and I approached a priest that I found. I asked him where he was going and said he was going to the Himalayas on a mission, and I told him that I was a fallen woman, and could you take me with you, Father? I really need saving. I was using all this really kind of weird religious language. And that's also another very common feature of psychosis. Loads of people use this kind of like religious language and imagery. I saw a kind of jewellery shop that was called Madame Butterflies, and if you know about the plot of Madame Butterfly, it's to do with a kind of ex-sex worker who gets syphilis and dies or something. There's some kind of tragedy involving a sex worker. Having been a dominatrix back in the day, I made this connection that somehow Madame Butterflies wasn't really a shop, it was a brothel, and that I needed to go sell myself into it in order to save myself. So I went in there and tried to do that.
You were really dangerous to yourself at this point.
Yeah, that's also the most important thing to say. We have these terrible news stories of people in the throes of psychosis that kill other people, but you are far more likely to take your own life or hurt yourself. Some of the staff tried to...
trust the wrong person. If you're trusting
Completely.
air steward or the priest who, you don't know, he might not be a priest.
Absolutely.
Could be anyone.
And if you were a nefarious person, isn't that exactly what you'd pick up? You know, some mad girl who thinks, like, you're going to protect her. I mean, it must happen all the time. They tried to give me some kind of pill that was going to calm me down. I presume it was something like diazepam. And I spat it out slyly and then escaped in the airport. By which point there was like all these staff watching me. I didn't know, obviously, at the time. It was explained to me later. But there were staff on alert trying to kind of like hunt me down. And then I had my carry-on bag.
Give you a sedative. Why did you not want to take it?
Because I thought it was poison, which is again a classic psychotic thing. If medical staff try and help you, you often think they're trying to kill you or poison you.
So you've landed in this airport and you're convinced that they're all trying to kill you. They're obviously actually trying to help you and give you medication to just calm you down, and you're like... I
told them. I shouted. Eventually, armed guards surrounded me because I was due to get on the aeroplane to Brisbane, a small plane, and I had my laptop bag with my laptop in it. And as the laptop went through the security, I went, "Bomb! There's a bomb in that bag! There's a bomb!" And everything went crazy. I remember there were cameras, people were taking pictures of me for social media, you know, people that obviously thought I was bonkers and thought it was funny, like making videos of me. But I remember thinking of it like it was like paparazzi, like I was getting caught or something, you know?
Why were you not arrested? Like, no offence, I would have arrested you. You can't go through an airport screaming bomb.
They could obviously see, they'd been tracking me for several hours in the airport, watching me and making a plan about how to handle me. So they obviously knew I was unwell and probably not a threat. That was obviously the decision and the conclusion they'd come to. But I remember actually after I shouted bomb, there were all these armed guards, because there were armed guards at Singapore, you know, surrounding me. There was like this one woman who was obviously kind of the boss and these other armed guards here. And it was terrifying. Like, it's just like terrifying remembering it, because I really thought, like, this is it. They're gonna kill me. And they told me that they needed to give me an injection to sedate me, to calm me down. And I absolutely believed with every fibre of my being it was a lethal injection and I was going to die. And I remember being sat in this chair in this kind of weird antechamber and them getting the injection. I remember it to this day. It's like a memory of escaping death. I really thought I had seconds left. And then when I didn't die, I was like, this is also a psychotic thing, by the way. I was like, oh, I'm superhuman. You know, it's like I've dodged death. I dodged the lethal injection. So I definitely must be super special and God's watching over me and all this kind of crap, you know. And then eventually I got on the plane because they somehow got my mum on the phone. And I had my mum's emergency contact details, you know, in the back of my passport, like a lot of people do. And they'd rung her and all of a sudden somebody kind of thrust a phone at me and it was my mum on the phone. And I remember to this day, like, her voice, you know, it was quavering. And she was so beside herself. Like, I get choked up just thinking about it. And I remember her just being like, "Love, you've got to get on that plane. You've got to trust me. You've got to get on that plane." Sorry, I get so upset thinking about it because...
No, it's an really emotional story.
It's so emotional, but also just really beautiful because I didn't trust her. I didn't trust anybody at this point.
Yeah.
But there was something about my mum's voice that got through to me in that moment. And then I got on the plane. And because I got on the plane, I arrived in Brisbane and my mum was waiting for me with my brother. And pretty soon after I collapsed and was taken to her GP, who immediately diagnosed me with psychosis, having a psychotic episode. And then I was sectioned in a hospital in Australia. And bizarrely, making that crazy trip saved my life because I think I would have killed myself, you know, if I'd have carried on in London by myself for any longer.
Well, so many things off what you just said there. I mean, number one, just, you know, and we both know it now as parents, can you even imagine if you've got a call from somewhere that is hours away across an ocean saying this is what your child is doing and we don't know what to do? Just that absolute fear of no matter what happens, there is a time in an aeroplane
completely
to help, and just that your mom's voice was the one that got through is really special. I guess my first question really is, do you feel lucky to you talk a lot about a lot of people end up taking their own lives, like do you feel like you really dodged a bullet there, or do you feel like I'm annoyed that people didn't catch this sooner in the UK?
No, I do feel lucky. I always feel lucky. You know, I've definitely used up many of my 9 lives by this point. I definitely feel like that. You know, it should never have got to that stage, but I do understand why it did. And also because I lived such a peripatetic life. You know, I was sort of in London and I was in LA. I was very unaccountable in many ways. It's not like I had a regular job that I went to every day, where I could turn up and colleagues could see that I wasn't okay. I didn't live with anyone. I didn't have a proper partner. My dad had just died. I had no other family. Do you know what I mean? It's like I was very untethered. And when I got better, in the years after, it was a wake-up call to me about how untethered we can live and how vulnerable that makes us. And, obviously, loads about me, Lewis, but, I have an incredible husband, I have a daughter, I have a beautiful home, I have a sausage dog, I have all these amazing friends. I have loads of ties to keep me on the ground and to keep me accountable now. Because what that taught me was that is the easiest way to lose yourself, is to not be tied to anything.
And some people, they don't have that loving
Lots of people don't.
That voice would get through to them. Yeah. So it's really interesting. And you're totally right. You need a support system, whether that is your family, your friends, your sausage dog. You need
completely.
That support system so that people can catch you. But what I wanted to ask you, because earlier on you were talking a little bit about, you went to the solicitors to write your will, and why didn't they know that your story was crazy and all of this other stuff? If we go out for dinner next week and you turn to me and say, I've got a bomb in my bag, like what should I do? Like, what's the course of action? If you're
number one, don't believe me. I've got forms, so if I say there's a bomb, there isn't one. I mean, that'd be a weird call my bluff, wouldn't it be, if I actually had a bomb?
Be like to the waiter, don't worry, she does this occasionally.
Can you imagine? That is a really good question, because actually there'll be lots of people probably listening that might know someone who's been a bit paranoid and a bit odd, and they don't know, maybe they have challenged some of their theories and it hasn't really worked. And what I would say is let them talk, let them say it all, the whole thing that they need to say, check the facts. So check, even if they can't check the facts, you check the facts. So they say that their neighbour's doing this XYZ crazy thing. Well, can you prove that? They say that somebody's been watching them, someone's surveilling their phone. Prove to them that that's not happening. But more importantly, prove to yourselves so you know if they're actually in danger or they're really unwell. And it's much more likely that they're unwell, And then the other thing I would say is, if they're persisting with the, all these things are happening line, say, well, this sounds really stressful, and I'm worried for you. I'm not worried about you, I'm worried for you. So why don't we go to the doctor to see if they can give you some medication to help you cope with this situation? Maybe they can give you something to help you feel a bit calmer so you can deal with this. If you can just get them to see a GP or go to A&E, it depends on the A&E, I'll be honest, but if you can get them in front of a medical professional, it will usually be quite easy to diagnose them. So, and then you don't have to, I'm not saying you don't have to worry about it anymore, but then it's in the hands of professionals that know what to do,
Yeah.
But the key thing is trying to get them in front of a medical professional, because it's actually a lot harder than it sounds.
No, I can imagine. You can't tell I'm taking you to the doctors. Why? Like, you think
about
looking after... I'm just thinking about, like, my parents, where my grandparents were here, like, trying to get them to go to the doctors to get their hearing checked. I don't need the doctors. So I think that's really hard. I also think, you were saying this, and actually I went for drinks with someone recently that was telling me that they had their account cloned on a dating app, and people were messaging them because, and impersonating them. And I'm like, well, that's a plausible story. And I do actually think that was the true story. But, it's like, sometimes things are on the cusp. You're not going to catch anything. And even if you did, as a friend of someone that's not like, a close friend, it's like, I'm not going to take you to the doctors over that, because you might well be right. You know what I mean? So is it about the frequency of every time I meet you, someone's after you? And
yeah. And it usually escalates. So maybe you see somebody one month and they're saying something just sounds a bit paranoid and bitter. You meet them a few weeks later and the story has escalated. Things are getting worse. Things are getting crazier. That's the sign. It's the escalation, because it won't just stay on a level. It won't just stay at a level, and it won't just go away by itself either. So that's what I was saying.
Things I wanted to ask you. Let's start with, so you were talking about the airport, and you're there screaming bomb, 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 and they they'd kind of decided you were not to be trusted about that. But we do hear a lot of things in the media around, people doing random things. You were saying, like, people are pulling out their phones and stuff. And I just wonder how this affects your compassion for when we get these viral stories of, there was this crazy person on a bus or whatever happened.
Right.
But then at the same time, if I was in an airport with my kids and someone was screaming bomb, that would freak me the hell out. So at the same time, where do you kind of stand on where we should be compassionate and where, you need to know the context of viral clips and things like that?
Yeah. I think you should always be compassionate. Always, just as a baseline, you should be compassionate and you should be curious about why someone's doing something or saying something. But the other thing you've got to assess is this person a danger to me right now? And especially as a parent, when you're out with your kids, you move away from the crazy person. We all do it, and it's understandable why. But if you see somebody who's obviously struggling and not well and needs help, and you can't offer it yourself, which most of us can't a lot of the time, at least notify someone who can. Always tell some member of staff in the place that you are at or on the vehicle you're on, tell them and get them, because it is up to them at that point. But what is shocking, I suppose, is there must have been so many instances where people who did spend quite a lot of time with me, and I won't mention any names for obvious legal reasons, must have thought Nikki isn't okay, but it never occurred to them to try and reach out to someone I was close to or a family member to help me. And again, part of that was just the nature of living in London as a freelance journalist and like being untethered to people, It's not like people knew where my mum was and could send her a message or call her. But it's interesting.
Also being you, like it's not far-fetched that as a journalist you would get into some...
Especially the stuff I've done. Yeah, the stuff I've done. I've got so many crazy stories. The truth is always stranger than fiction in my world. And that's also why it just was potentially happening, Loads of people afterwards said to me, we did think it was true for a while. And even the GP, when I went back to the GP many months later for something completely different, once I was on the mend, the GP said to me, we had a meeting about you when you came in twice. And I told you to go to the police. She said, because we really couldn't decide if you were psychotic or not. And that's pretty terrifying that the GP, a bunch of GPs
and they
in
saw
a surgery
you a few
couldn't
times,
decide.
and when you got to Australia, it was kind of like, well, obviously, I know things had gotten a bit more advanced by that point. So did you ever go to the police? Did anyone...
Yeah, I went to the police several times. And actually, the police were weirdly better at dealing with me than the NHS because they've obviously had a lot of time spent talking to people that were a bit mad and paranoid and, remember what the police are looking for is evidence of a crime. So you go and report a crime, well, they're still going to want to know, well, what's the evidence this is happening? Whereas a mental health practitioner doesn't tend to think that way necessarily. So the police very quickly, when I would go in and start telling the mad sex trafficking story, they just knew it wasn't real. They knew I was unwell. And one particular police officer, I told him this crazy story one night, and then he said, okay, I'm going to write this down and submit it. And then I was like, oh my God, no, you can't do that. And he's like, what? I was like, well, if you write it down, then the traffickers will find out and they'll kill me. And I remembered him just like putting his pen down and looking at me, and he was quite young and he was really thoughtful. And he said, okay, I'll do you a deal. If you go around the corner and go to that hospital and just tell them what you've told me, I won't file it. And what he was doing was what I've just told you to do. He was getting me in front of mental health people that could, diagnose me with something seriously wrong.
That's quite clever.
Yeah.
So actually the police sometimes
weirdly,
better, because I guess you're right. They would deal with it maybe a little bit more, actually see the more extreme versions of it and be able to sort of clock it straight away. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about rebuilding trust. So if you have been sectioned, you've had psychosis, everyone knows about it, and suddenly, people are thinking, oh my God, so she wasn't really being chased by the mafia? And how do you begin to rebuild trust? Because surely if the mafia was after you now, you'd be a great victim because no one would believe a word you were saying. They'd be like,
well, exactly, I'm the perfect victim. And I have said that to a few friends, if I ever go missing, don't investigate it.
So how do you rebuild trust, and how do you then open up about things that you are worried about? And sometimes, are you more nervous to talk about things that you maybe are a little bit paranoid about?
Well, the main thing is, firstly, it happened 10 years ago and I'm only just talking about it. So that tells you something really important, which is that I've spent the best part of a decade learning to trust myself again. I mean, that does come back after about a year, but it is terrifying then realising that actually maybe your mind isn't as reliable as you thought it was. I was on an antipsychotic medication for a long time and that stabilised me, and there was no way I could go into psychosis again while I was on the medication, but I've come off it now. The thing is about psychosis that once you've experienced it, you know what it is. So if it was to start to happen again, I would know this time. So it could never be like it had been before. in a weird way, if you survive the first episode, it becomes its own safeguard, you know? And the other thing is that I've just been very, very private. I mean, I'm not a private person, you know, I've made a career out of oversharing. But this particular thing I've been so private about because my reputation has really ridden on it. You know, if people thought, exactly like you say, if people thought I was mentally unreliable, well, they wouldn't be hiring me to comment on TV and radio anymore, would they? They wouldn't be hiring me to write. So it's been being very, very careful about what I told when. But, you know, 10 years later, in really strong mental health and in a solid personal setup, I'm in a good position to tell the story. And I want to do, because psychosis is increasing, like episodes are increasing. You know, the Charity Mind says that 1 in 100 people in the UK will experience psychosis in a lifetime. That is a wild statistic, and yet we never talk about it, and we desperately need to bust the taboo.
So, I mean, on that, what would you like to see change? I mean, you're obviously now sharing your story after 10 years. You are in a position, because you have got, as you say, that 10 years to say, look, I'm okay now. I feel better about this. A lot of people aren't in your situation. They're sort of probably dealing with their recovery while still trying to pay the bills. And if people don't want them in, you know, the bar where they worked because they were telling all of the staff that, you know, things were going on, like, how do we fix this situation?
Well, the best thing we can do is build understanding across society, right? You know, I shouldn't have been able to go to a GP several times with them failing to recognise what was happening. GPs only get a couple of hours training they used to only get a couple of hours training about psychosis before they were able to practice. That's ridiculous. I mean, I think the mental health training is shifting now, but they need a lot more help. So all medical practitioners need to really understand how it happens and be able to see the signs. Police, I think, actually already can, but, you know, those kinds of institutions where people regularly help people, they all need to really, really know. The same with HR departments. I don't think the majority of people that work in HR know what psychosis is, and they wouldn't know how to spot it in somebody that worked for them. That is a massive, massive undertaking, but it's the easiest thing to do. We could have some incredible training for people that work in HR. And then the thing is if bit by bit we understand that people get what psychosis is and that you can recover, that will start to bust the taboo, because people will stop being as afraid then of going to HR or ringing their bank or, you know, going to the doctor or whatever. And then over a period of time, it's just going to become sort of understood, and people will be like, oh yeah, we know what that is. That's fine. I'm really sorry that happened to you. Here's the support we can give you.
To people that maybe are watching this because they are worried themselves that they are suffering with psychosis, or they know someone that is, and they're looking for a little bit of hope, like, can you just talk a little bit about your recovery and those kind of milestones you hit? I mean, you sort of said you had this big episode with bombs and landing planes and all of this stuff that had gone on. You got sectioned. Like, what do they do in section? I mean, that seems terrifying to me, like, to be sectioned, but what do they do to you?
Well, the main thing is that they give you medication, which you initially refuse and spit out, but eventually you start to take. And they can administer it by force if they have to. They didn't it with me. They give you a medication that brings the chemical levels back down in your brain, and when that happens, your thinking starts to shift back to normal patterns of thinking, and you start to have normal thoughts. It's a really curious experience as a human being, because what happens is you having these what have become normal paranoid thoughts, you know, delusional thoughts, and then all of a sudden you have a regular thought. And you think, that's interesting. And the more regular thoughts you have, the more they challenge the kind of bonkers thoughts in your own head. And you start to sort of think, maybe that doesn't make sense anymore. Maybe that isn't happening. Maybe that person is trustworthy. Maybe that person wasn't out to get me. It's a really curious process. And then bit by bit, as long as you follow through with the treatment and don't, you know, leave the hospital or anything like that, you will get better. But, you know, we've got to be realistic. Some people will go on to have many episodes in a lifetime. Some people will develop full-blown schizophrenia, for example. So, I don't want to paint this, like, overly rosy picture of saying anyone that has psychosis will never have it again. It's not like that. But lots of people that have a single episode, if they're treated correctly in the first instance, can never have it again. Like, they can live a really well life.
And do they know what caused it, or causes it in general? Because you obviously talked about, you know, you just lost your dad.
Yeah.
Struggling for money, you're flying backwards and forward, your circadian rhythm is completely messed up. So with you, it's like a lot of things are out of whack. But then what does that do? Does that just kick in some sort of primitive thing in your brain that's sort of a defense mechanism that's like, everyone's out to get me? Or is it the chemicals in the brain? Like, how, what is it?
Well, they say it's a chemical imbalance. It's a massive amount of stress on the brain and body, and then something kind of snaps. Your thinking changes as a means of protecting you from the horrible reality of what's just happened that you can't get your head around. That's kind of what it is. And obviously, you know, hormones can have a big factor in that, hence why people get postpartum psychosis when they have a baby. You know, not everyone, but some people have it because the massive surges of hormones and chemical shifts create this overload, and it can happen then. It's really to do with a crazy amount of stress on the brain and body. And obviously everyone's got a different bandwidth for stress. So it's not like there's a set point. These things will happen and then you will have psychosis. Everybody's different.
So if someone was listening to this, what is the one thing that you would hope that they would take from your story, and what are you hoping to do by sharing it now?
A couple of things. One, that none of us can trust our minds as much as we think we can. We take for granted our sanity. Your sanity is much more flimsy than you think. And that'll probably terrify some people. But actually, if you lead a healthy life and you have healthy behaviours, you can stay really well forever, regardless of any mental health factors or situational factors. And it starts with the basics, like sleeping, eating properly, regulating yourself, you know, not taking stimulants or crazy drugs, having good social relations, doing work you care about. That's less important. You can't help whether you have a job that you like or you don't. But, you know, it's about building a really solid foundation for your life. Like, all good mental health rests on that. And, you know, some people are more unlucky than others. Some people do have a propensity for schizophrenia. Some people don't, you know, so it's like, what? You know, there's like genetic factors about why you might be more predisposed to certain things. Some of it's situational, but when you get better from something like this, you can do a lot to shore up your life and ensure that you never have it again. And so that's kind of my second point, is that this can happen to anyone, to absolutely anyone, under the right or wrong circumstances, however you want to put it. And so for that reason, we have to be vigilant and we have to be compassionate.
Nikki, thank you so much for sharing this story. I mean, you know, I think you're brilliant anyway, but I think that sharing this story and going so public with it, I know it's scary, and I think you're going to help a lot of people with this. So well done for continuing to be brilliant. If people want to find out more about you and more about your story, where would you like to send them?
So please sign up to my Substack, Psychotopia. It's under my name, Nichi Hodgson. It's where I'm exploring the topic in so many different ways. I've written a third of a book, which I'm trying to get published. So if you like the Substack, it's going to help me get the book published, which I'm really, really kind of gunning for. And just follow me on social media. I don't really use X anymore because it's just such a cesspit, but I'm very active on Instagram at Nichi Hodgson. And I love to talk with people about this stuff. So please come and ask me questions.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.